the discussion is on the spiraling crisis in Myanmar. Since the military coup in 2021, Myanmar has witnessed one of the worst internal conflicts. Humanitarian crisis is worsening. Thousands of people have been killed. About a million have been displaced. As far as the role of external players are concerned, so far the international community's role has been a failure, to say the least. And to discuss all this, we have Bertil Lintner, author and commentator. He has been following Myanmar for many years, for many decades now, and we are happy to have him to discuss all these issues. Welcome, Bertil.
Thank you.
Let's begin with the nature of the conflict itself. Bertil, I want to start with how does one even begin to understand the nature of this conflict in Myanmar? Is it a civil war? Is it a democratic uprising? Is it a nation in revolt? How would you describe the conflict in Myanmar today?
Well, it's actually all of the above. There's an ethnic conflict that's been raging virtually since independence in 1948. And there has been from various non-Burma nationalities within what has been called the Union of Myanmar. No, it's not called the Union of Myanmar. That conflict is not new. And it's been going, wading back and forth over the decades. What has happened since the coup is that many pro-democracy activists and people who were, were opposed to the reimposition of military rule have also taken up arms against the new junta that seized power in 2021. And this is actually the first time since the 1970s that there is fighting in the Myanmar heartland. Before, it was confined to the frontier areas where the ethnic minorities, well, I don't really like the term ethnic minority because they're not a minority in the area where they live. Let's say the non-Burma nationalities. And so in the 1970s, of course, the Burmese Communist Party was very active in many parts of central Burma, but they were sort of wiped out from that part of the country in the mid-1970s. But now for the first time, we see heavy fighting in Sagaing, Magwe region, Tenasserim, the Irrawaddy, and even urban guerrilla warfare. That is something completely new. So you can say it's a kind of pro-democracy uprising, that's correct. It's also an ethnic civil war. And it's reaching a crisis where I can say that the government seems to be losing control over very large parts of the country.
Mm-hmm.
The government, I mean the junta.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Also, as the conflict sort of intensifies, we have also seen both sides hardening their position and suggesting that they're willing to take the conflict to its logical conclusion. Mm-hmm. How would you assess that?
Well, basically, you can say this is a war that neither side, or no side really, can win. The military, the ruling military, cannot. They're not strong enough to defeat all these various resistance armies which you find in ethnic areas and also in the so-called in the heartland. They also split up on too many fronts across the country. But on the other hand, the opposition is not unified at all. I mean, there are many different groups. You see all these very upbeat press reports about how the Burmans and the non-Burmans are united against the military and against the junta. Yes, they are against the junta, all of them, but they're certainly not united. I mean, not even the various non-Burma groups are united among themselves. You've got Kachin and Shan and Karen, and there's been traditional rivalries even between those groups. So not only between the non-Burma nationalities and the Burma majority of the population. So, I mean, it is a very messy situation, and I can't really see any way out of this. It seems worse than ever. I mean, I covered the civil war, and it is a civil war, for more than 40 years. And this is the messiest and the most difficult situation I've experienced so far.
So soon after the military coup, we have seen the battle sort of concentrating in the west of Myanmar, particularly in Chin and Sagaing region, Chin State and Sagaing region. In the recent months, we have seen the battlefield shifting towards the east to Kaya, Mon, and Kayin states. How would you explain this shift of the battlefields? And to add to that is the recent sort of attempts by the military junta to sort of find some peace talks with the ethnic groups, armed groups in the north. Is that also an attempt to sort of preempt the possibility of a front opening up in the north?
Well, what the military is doing is basically a divide and rule policy. They have no interest in really entering into any serious dialogue or negotiation with any opposition group, Burma or non-Burma. They are determined to stay in power by any means possible, and possibly change it a little bit to be more acceptable to the outside world. But they would give up power after having been in power virtually under different guises since 1962 is out of the question. They become a state within the state, which is basically taking over the state. And for that system to change, you will actually need a split within the military itself. Otherwise, nothing is going to change. And as far as the fighting in the country goes, yes, there was a lot of fighting and there has been a lot of fighting in the west near the Indian border and on the border with Mizoram and Manipur. But there's also, even from the very beginning, there was fighting along the Thai border as well. The reason why we are saying more about the fighting close to the Thai border is probably because it's easy access, for instance, for the media, and it's probably a bit easier also to get supplies across the border from Thailand than it would be to get supplies across the border from India. So there are many factors there, but by and large, you can say that certain of these areas did not see any fighting at all until recently. Chin State was the only non-Burma state that really did not have any insurgency, because the Chins, there's many different tribes among the Chins. They don't even have a common lingua franca, so they're very different from the Kachin or the Karen and so on. Well, they also speak different languages, but at least they got something in common. But the Chins were not. There was political groups among the Chins, yes, but nothing that even resembles what we're seeing today. That is quite an astonishing development, because some of the heaviest resistance is actually right there in Chin State. And then, of course, you got Sagaing and the Magway regions, which were, basically part of the Myanmar heartland. And they have not seen any fighting since the 1970s. So it is a situation which I don't think even the military had predicted when they moved in to, take over power, absolute power, in 2021. I think it's coming from a complete surprise to them as well. They probably thought that, yes, there will be some resistance and demonstrations, but we will shoot some and then the people will, go home again. But that hasn't happened. And the fighting is still continuing in many parts of the country. As for peace talks goes, they're trying to approach the military is trying to approach certain, the ethnic armed organizations, as they're called. But again, this is just to make sure that they don't establish any firm links with any other ethnic armed organizations or the Burman resistance. It is not meant to bring the country any step towards, peace.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So coming to the military itself, according to some recent studies, the strength of the military has been dwindling over the years in recent months. In the face of casualties in battles, desertions, defections, and the difficulty of finding new recruits. Mm-hmm. There is also some studies that suggest that the military's increasing reliance on air power is because of the inability to control to hold territory on the ground. What is your assessment about the strength of the Tatmadaw or the military today in Myanmar?
Well, I mean, the question of air power is actually just brought in a completely new phenomenon, an element into the civil war. When I started covering this war back in the early 80s, the Burma Air Force was, as it was called at that time, was nothing. I mean, there were some old Fokkers, and they got some planes from Switzerland were not much use at all. And but since the first pro-democracy uprising in recent years, or the one in 1988, the military embarked on a modernization program, and it started building up the Air Force and the Navy, two sectors of the armed forces who have been neglected thus far. And so it is actually not new that they are building up an Air Force, but this is the first time they're actually using the Air Force. And that is, of course, you can say their strength, because I mean, on the ground, they fared quite badly against different groups. And I say different groups because there's no coordination. There's attacks and ambushes here and there. And that is, of course, is the main problem for the opposition today, the air power, helicopter gunships, jet fighters even, and bombers and so on. That's never happened before. And that is, of course, the strength of the military. And that is the strongest card they have to play against the various resistance groups, because they don't possess any kind of surface air missiles or anything, any other weapons with which they could shoot down the various kinds of aircraft. The only exception there is the United War State Army, which is well equipped with manpads and so on, but they're not sharing those with any other ethnic armed organization. And the reason for that is quite easy to understand. Those were supplied by China for the wars as a deterrent to make sure that the military would not attack them. They were not actually meant to shoot down airplanes. It was to make it possible for the war to control 20,000 square kilometer area along the Chinese border, for them to be able to stay where they are without the risk of being attacked.
Sure. No, you mentioned about the discoordination among the opposition forces. Some recent reports suggest that there is perhaps greater coordination today among the PDFs and the ethnic armed organizations, particularly in the east, in Kayin and Kaya and Mon and Bago as well. Taking the case of the blasting of the bridges, the infrastructure, roads, and others. So would you still say that opposition unity remains a major challenge for the opposition, the resistance movement?
Absolutely. I mean, you can see along the, in the East that some of the Burma groups and some of the ethnic groups are working together, but there's no overall coordination. And above all, there doesn't seem to be any strategy. It's a kind of defensive war, and then they war on the offensive. But I can't see how these various military attacks and maneuvers are coordinated in any way, and how they will lead to some kind of major offensive, unified offensive against the Myanmar military. We're still talking about very fragmented opposition. It is strong, and it's done remarkably well, I would say, especially in Kayao Karenni state, the smallest of Myanmar's ethnic states. And no one had expected that to happen there. But there, I mean, they actually managed to take over large chunks of territory, and they have even their own police forces and that sort of thing. But still, if you take the situation there and the situation in Chin State, I cannot see any coordination between that at all. And this is, of course, the main problem. And I think many outside observers clearly overestimate and overstate the degree of cooperation and collaboration that exists between all these different groups. I've seen some really fanciful reports talking about 100,000 ethnic groups and ethnic soldiers, 60,000 or 80,000 Burman resistance force soldiers and so on. That's pure nonsense. It's not anywhere near that. I mean, the main weakness of the Tatmadaw when they are fighting all these groups They said they're spread out over too many areas. They cannot really, if they concentrate in one area, fighting will erupt in another, and they have to move troops around all the time. And they simply don't have the resources to fight a war on that many fronts across the country. And that's why what I would describe as a stalemate actually continues, because there are no, again, the resistance forces are strong within the respective areas, but not in sort of they're not unified behind any kind of long-term or even short-term strategy how to defeat the military or the junta. That I haven't seen any signs of at all, really.
Sure. Now, let me now take the conversation to the role of external players. As you're aware, the sharp sort of divide between the isolation and sanctions policy versus the constructive engagement seems to continue to define the role of external players in Myanmar. In fact, this international divide is not helping in any way in finding a solution to the Myanmar crisis. You would recall in 2010, when the Myanmar first conducted its election after over 2 decades, both the constructivist the countries, adopting the constructivist, rather constructive engagement, and those adopting the sanction and isolation policy, both sort of claim credit to have brought about change in Myanmar. Is there a lesson we can learn from the past here?
Well, what happened in 2010 was not an outcome of either side. I mean, no outside pressure as such. There was something completely different. You can say that decades of isolation had forced Myanmar into the hands of China. And there was something that not even the Myanmar military felt comfortable with. I have seen classified internal Myanmar army documents from the time before 2010, when they actually say that our sovereignty is in danger. We may even lose our independence of China. It was a bit exaggerated, but it was really alarmist like that. And they said we have to open up to the West in order to counterbalance China's influence here, because it's becoming too overwhelming. And that is exactly what they did after 2010. But they also realized that in order to reestablish any kind of rapport or relations with Western countries or democracies across the world, they would have to take certain steps. So that's why we saw this, what was happening under the government of Thein Sein, as an army general was before, I mean, secretary one of the junta that was ruled the country at that time. He was not Democrat. He was not Burmese Gorbachev, as some people claimed called him. He was just putting into action a policy that's been worked out by the military. That yes, they could afford to let opposition parties function. They could afford a free press. They could afford, foreign journalists, including myself. I've been blacklisted, or was blacklisted in the country for many years, to come in and write about it. Because under the 2008 Constitution, which they basically have written themselves, they were sure of absolute power behind the scenes. So there wasn't that much. When people were talking about democratic transition, there was no transition. There was just a different kind of military rule. But what happened during that time, that is very important to remember, during that time of openness, which lasted for about 10 years, was that a whole generation, more or less, of young people grew up in a different environment. They became used to exercising certain freedoms, and they were the ones who did not accept the coup when it happened. They were in the thousands, in the tens of thousands, demonstrating across the country, because they didn't want to see a return to the bad old days of, when their parents were young, or when they, were under military rule. And that is something that military probably had not expected when they decided to open up the country in 2000, after the election in 2010. It was not until 2011, 2012 that things started happening. It started to happen. But that is, of course, why we're seeing this resistance across the country, not only in the non-Burma frontier areas, but also in the Burmese heartland. That is a new development, which the military brought on themselves, really, by allowing this kind of openness. But as I said, it was never meant to be a transition. They had a constitution which was there, and to amend the constitution was impossible. And that constitution ensured a leading role of the military in political affairs.
Mm-hmm. And talking about ASEAN, ASEAN's role, its peace efforts there. Recently, the Singaporean diplomat turned scholar, Bilahari Kaushik, sort of questioned the ASEAN's approach of disengaging the military junta. Now, the Thai initiative of getting involved in some of the neighboring countries to re-engage the military leaders there in Myanmar is again in the same, sort of the thinking sort of line with the Singaporean diplomat. What is your view about ASEAN's role in terms of whether they're disengaging the military regime has been that's a problem, or what are the other options they have?
Well, first of all, we have to understand that ASEAN is probably the most overrated of regional blocs across the globe. It was not set up to become what it is today. It was basically a continuation of the old Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, an anti-communist, anti-China, Soviet Union bloc of Western allies in Southeast Asia. Mm-hmm. For decades, the only issue they actually pursued was Cambodia. But then suddenly the whole thing changed. It became more about trade and so on. But when it comes to political issues, ASEAN is guided by two golden principles, cardinal principles: non-interference, consensus. And if you're guided by those two principles, you cannot do anything. And if you look at the history of ASEAN, they're not meant to solve a single crisis in the country, in a member country, or between two member states. I mean, take East Timor. They couldn't intervene there because it was seen as an internal Indonesian issue. Eventually, Australia and the UN had to intervene. They've been close to, there was almost a border war between Thailand and Cambodia over the Copper Vihan, a temple complex, a disputed area on the border. ASEAN did nothing. You have border disputes between Thailand and Laos. You have border disputes between the Philippines and Malaysia up in North Borneo and Sabah. You have cross-border insurgencies Muslim insurgencies in southern Thailand, Malaysia. ASEAN cannot do anything. So one shouldn't expect ASEAN to do anything. They can issue some statements and say something, but not more than that. And if you look at the official policy, this 5-point consensus, or whatever they call it, it's a non-starter. It isn't led to anything. But what has happened, though, is we can see a split within ASEAN. That the countries really don't know how to deal with the situation in Myanmar. Because first of all, they can't. They can just say something. And even that would not have much impact. You have Indonesia, which is taking a more principled stand, I would say. Then they go Thailand and Singapore, which are, interested in, business deals, whatever, And then, of course, you're totally undemocratic members of ASEAN. You have to remember that most countries of ASEAN are not democracies at all. We look at Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, Brunei, absolute monarchy, Singapore somewhere in between, Malaysia somewhere in between. I mean, the ultimate irony is actually that the world's largest Muslim country, the most populous Muslim country in the world, Indonesia, is the only true democracy in ASEAN. When I live in Thailand, when the military now is trying to subvert the outcome of the election by all sorts of tricks and the dirty games. So Thailand is not a democracy either. So I cannot see ASEAN acting in any constructive way at all. And we can perhaps got to pay a little bit less attention to what they are doing. But the countries that really matter are, of course, Myanmar's immediate neighbors. And there's China, there's India. Thailand, okay, yes, individually, but not as part of ASEAN. Bangladesh to some extent because of the refugees, the Rohingya
Yes.
refugees there. But the crucial issue here, which we must remember, let's look at the map of Asia. China is a huge inland empire. The comparatively short coastline with such a big country. It's not like India, but it's got a big, long west coast and an east coast and so on. And the differences in India are not really between various parts of the country in that sense. It's more about economic development and social issues. But when China started to introduce free market reforms back in the 80s, the coastal provinces took off immediately, whereas the landlocked hinterland lagged behind. And as early as 1985 was the first time I saw it, the Chinese started talking about an outlet to the Indian Ocean to bypass the contested South China Sea and, of course, the Straits of Malacca, and also that it would be too difficult for those landlocked provinces to catch up with the very rapid development at that time in the coastal areas. So Myanmar was identified already at that time as a possible outlet for exports from the landlocked western provinces or western parts of China. So if you look at the map, the only three countries which border China, which have access to the Indian Ocean, there's Pakistan, there's India, and Myanmar. Pakistan is just too messy, and it's too unpredictable. And that Karakoram Highway, yes, it does exist, of course, but it's one of the most dangerous highways in the world. It's located too far west in China anyway. India, well, forget about it. I mean, the Chinese have tried to open a trade route down to Sikkim and then down to Calcutta, but that's not going to happen for very obvious reasons. So Myanmar is the main outlet for Chinese economic expansion, you can say that, and for the inland provinces to be able to catch up with the coastal provinces. And this is something that Chinese security analysts have been discussing for decades. It's nothing new at all. And this is why Myanmar is of utmost strategic importance to China. That is something, and all the other countries, whether they're in favor of engagement or not, have to understand and how to deal with that issue. Because at the same time, we must know that people in Myanmar and the military in Myanmar are not very happy with this heavy dependence on China either. But this is a very complex issue, but it's an issue that's got it's not got enough attention from the outside world. People talk about democracy here, democracy there, but that's not really the issue.
Yeah, no, in fact, I have actually, on China, often China is seen as the most powerful outside force in the Myanmar crisis. But if you look at China's brokered peace talks in the north, so far it has been a failure.
Yeah.
So how do you sort of explain this paradox with China's role?
Let's say, just for argument's sake, all the ethnic groups, ethnic armed organizations in Myanmar, the opposition, the democratic opposition, they sit down and they work out a solution. Yes, fine, the war is over. Everyone is happy. Let's have peace across the country. The first country to lose would be China. They will lose all the leverage they have inside the country right now. We go to the United World State Army, the strongest, best equipped ethnic armed organization. We've got close links with the Kachin Independence Organization and army in the north. China doesn't want to have any instability on its borders. They don't want to have refugees coming across the borders and so on. But a certain degree of instability in Myanmar serves China's long-term strategic interests. They're not interested in peace. In peace in the sense that the whole issue will be solved. I mean, that's never going to happen anyway. But that is not in their interest. And that's why they're dealing with one group and another group, trying to keep them under control. But as I said, if these groups vanished from the scene, China would lose more than any other outside power in terms of being able to exercise influence in Myanmar, inside Myanmar.
Sure. No, and also talking about India's role. India's approach to the Myanmar crisis is often defined as a careful act of balancing by engaging the junta as well as the pro-democracy forces. Um, what's your own assessment of India's policy, Myanmar policy, and do you think the time has come for India to recalibrate its policy towards Myanmar?
Well, I'm not a policy advisor to the Indian government, obviously, so I can't tell you what to do. But I think what India is lacking, though, is a coherent Myanmar policy. It seems to be a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and it somewhat depends who is in power in New Delhi, and also the fact that the various states in India are fairly autonomous when it comes to many issues. You take Mizoram, for instance, which totally ignored the order from the center not to accept any refugees. Now, how could they? The Mizos and the Chins are so closely related. They're almost like, ethnic cousins, and there have been thousands of Chins living in Mizoram for years, and so on. So Mizoram had its own policy. Manipur became more complicated. I don't even want to get into that issue because it's so messy right now. But there is also a spillover of what has happened, to some extent, a spillover of developments across the border in Myanmar. It also has to do with the fact that India doesn't really have any coherent policy when it comes to these issues. And one of the reasons for that, of course, I'm a little biased here because I'm interested in Myanmar and I'm interested in that part of the world. But it seems that India has always been totally preoccupied with its western border, Kashmir and so on. That is tend to overshadow all other issues. But if you look at the eastern border, what do we have there? We have cross-border insurgencies. We have a potential trade routes to Southeast Asia, when the whole look east now act east policy. You have access to power, if India would like to develop that, which they did, but abandoned it because there was too much public opposition to it. And then, of course, you have geostrategic interest, how to keep China's influence at the minimum in Myanmar. So if you look at all those arguments, in my view, India's eastern border should be the most important one, not the western one, because that's a stalemate. Nothing is going to change there. There's going to be more of the same. But there has been really no policy, long-term policy worked out how to deal with this troublesome neighbor that Myanmar has in the east. And that has been lacking, and that is really, I think, something that India should be paying more attention to.
Mm-hmm.
What India should do, that's not up to me to say. That's up to them.
Sure.
Tell me what to do. Just more attention.
Well, yeah. Mm-hmm. And Bertil, about Myanmar itself, you know very well, this is not the first military coup in Myanmar, nor the first military atrocities against its own people. In fact, Myanmar's history has been a story of the military versus the people. With the resistant forces today, viewing this as an opportunity to remove the military once and for all, do you think a new history, a new political history in Myanmar will emerge after this conflict?
Well, it's very hard to say, and when people from Myanmar ask me that question, I always tell them that I'm not a fortune teller. It's a very popular occupation in their country. But for the military to be dislodged from power by these opposition forces, I cannot see that happening. Okay, we're talking about popular support. The military has almost no popular support at all, and they know that they're universally hated across the country. Now just look at the outcome of any kind of free election they have allowed to take place. And the opposition, in various areas, of course, is far more popular support than the military. But they don't have the equipment to be able to overthrow the military or dislodge them from power. And they don't have the unity that would be required for such a decisive move against the central power holders. So that's why I think it's more likely we'll see more of the same. And I think I've actually argued ever since the uprising in 1988, that the only element that could possibly bring about fundamental change is a split within the armed forces. But then they could lead to an even bloodier civil war if you have, various factions of the well-equipped Myanmar military fighting each other. But unless there is a breakdown of command from the very top, that there is some kind of movement within the military itself, I can only see more misery on the horizon. I cannot see anything really changing. But then again, we have to remember that the Myanmar military are very good at throwing out these interesting things just to make people confused. For instance, letting the Thai foreign minister, Don Pravuddinai, meet Aung San Suu Kyi. And oh, maybe there's an opening here now. There can be a dialogue, maybe. But it's not about that at all. I mean, the fact is that the military, by allowing this meeting to take place, they have some confusion among the various resistance groups, and also created a split within ASEAN. That was the purpose of it. There are even rumors that Aung San Suu Kyi may be released on August the 1st. I mean, I'm saying it's a rumor. But if that happened, then the whole world would say, oh, look at that. Something is really positive happening. It's a step forward. Actually, it's not. It's just part of the game that the military have played for years to remain in power. And since they've been in power since 1962, they know how to exercise power better than anybody else. They know how to play all sort of cards with their neighbors and the outside world. And they're masters of that. I have to admire that. I have to admit that. And I admire them for the skill and the way that they are found a way to exercise power in a way that no other military in the world has done. I cannot think of anyone that has that kind of, it's been in power for that long, under different guises, of course. It's unique.
Well, we are coming to the end of the interview. Maybe the last question. This is regarding the peace initiative, or the solution to the Myanmar crisis. The general sense is that the solution should be driven internally. I think that's a general, acceptance agreement among the people. But to move towards such a solution, perhaps the country would need some external pressure or persuasion. So how do you see things unfold in the coming few months?
Well, you're right, and I agree with you in principle. But the problem is that there have been too many, especially Western actors, various NGOs, various individuals, even governments coming there giving all sort of stupid advice to the military and the other groups there. And it's a kind of almost a colonial attitude that we have to go in there and tell them how to run the country. And this arrogance on the part of many of these Western peacemakers especially. I know that many people, and even people like myself, find extremely annoying. But they're getting involved in the conflict and know absolutely nothing about, really. They come in with all sorts of crazy suggestions for solutions. And then lots of money. I mean, I call it the peace industrial complex, because that's what it has been. And that is actually, we have to forget about that. I can imagine that countries like India will be able to play a much more constructive role, because first of all, you're much closer to the problem. And you have problems in the northeast of India, which is not that different from the ethnic conflicts in Myanmar. You have more experience of dealing with that kind of situation. And I would have more confidence in what India did, if it really had a coherent policy, than I would have in any decisions taken by Switzerland or Norway or Canada or anything like that. That's irrelevant. It's just making the situation worse. Very important.
Sure. Bertil, thank you so much for your time.